Morning, everyone. Welcome to our third and final day of presentations. We have 4 scholars presenting today. We'll start off with Ashley.
Hi guys, thanks for coming. So I decided to research how women's fashion has evolved throughout the 20th century, and I'll be highlighting important figures. Okay, so I chose this topic because I've always found fashion to be an interesting topic, and it is often looked past because I think people think it's just the clothes that we wear, but it is so much more. Fashion can and is used to express identities and create social change. People use clothes to make statements and create art. The fashion industry is way bigger and has more history than people realize. I want to show the strides women have taken in this industry from the 1900s to modern day. So some of the questions I'm going to be answering today are: how has fashion influenced gender roles? What are some of the big influences on the fashion industry? And how have fashion and beauty standards changed over time? So I'm going to give a little bit of background information. So the Prohibition in the United States refers to the period between 1920 and 1933, when the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages were constitutionally outlawed. Speakeasies became an iconic part of American social life. These underground bars and clubs were crucial to the persistence of alcohol consumption, despite the government's best efforts to enforce the ban. Women and men were now allowed to drink together in speakeasies. Speakeasies offered a place where different social classes, races, and genders could mingle more freely. Many women attended speakeasies in groups, often participating in the vibrant social scene. Some speakeasies even catered specifically to women, offering a safe place where women could drink and dance, socialize, without the restrictions of the conventions of the time. The Roaring Twenties was also a time of cultural revolution, and speakeasies became a central part of the era's nightlife. World War II began in 1939 when men were being shipped off and leaving women to fill their shoes in the workforce. At this time, women were still considered second-class citizens and discriminated against in the labor market. But after the start of the war, women were now being encouraged to join the workforce to fill in for men. At first, they were just recruiting women from the lower class to work. But after more men left, they needed women from the middle class as well. Women in the middle class in the 1940s have never really worked outside the home and most likely had little children to take care of. During World War II, America lost resources like buttons, types of cloth, amount of fabric, pocket, zippers, and the height of heels. The lack of these materials led to muted colored clothing and shorter skirts, which influenced the industry in great ways for women. Women had no option but to accept the clothing that was available to them. Thus led to the drastic change in the fashion industry seen in the 1940s and 1960s, with youthful culture on the rise and America being the fashion capital of the world for a very short period of time. America had embraced the look of more comfortable clothing, and due to the shortage of supplies, the two-piece swimwear became acceptable. Fashion has always been a powerful tool for expressing and shaping societal norms, including gender roles. Over the centuries, clothing and style choices have been used to signify a person's social identity, status, and most importantly, their gender. As societal views of gender have evolved, so too has fashion, playing a significant role in both reinforcing and challenging traditional gender roles. In the Victorian era, which was from 1957 to 1901, gender roles were firmly enforced. Women's fashion, such as the tightly cinched waist and the voluptuous skirts, symbolized the limitations placed on women's physical freedom, reinforcing the idea of domesticity, fragility, and compliance. Women's fashion has historically been framed and focused on beauty and appearance. Corsets, petticoats, and later high heels were all designed to shape and accentuate the body in ways that aligned with ideas of fragility and submission. Fashion for women often emphasized their roles as caregivers, mothers, and objects of beauty rather than as independent agents in the workforce or in public life. Corsets even affected fertility rates in the middle class because of how restricting they were on the female form. The corset, which weakens and stops active movement, was a manifestation of women's forced submission and dependence on males. The women's suffrage movement, women fought for the right to vote. They also began to challenge fashion norms. Suffragettes like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton wore more practical, less restrictive clothing like loose dresses, bloomers, and even pantaloons, signaling both their rejection of traditional gender roles and their desire for more freedom, autonomy, and mobility in their lives. In 1950s, women had dresses advertised to them as porch dresses, nice enough to be seen from the porch of your home, but not outside it. In 1953, a house dress with an attachable apron came out. This dress had elastic threads for a tight but breathable fit. The dress was advertised for as the holiday hostess and in the budget. Women in the 50s didn't usually host because evenings were spent with family, so they didn't need extravagant dresses. Fashion has always been a reflection of society's views on gender, and over time it has both reinforced and challenged traditional gender roles. From the strict gender distinctions of the past to the neutral and gender-fluid expression of the present, fashion plays a pivotal role in shaping how we understand gender. As societal views continue to evolve, fashion will likely remain a powerful tool for self-expression and identity and resistance to traditional gender norms. The 1920s brought about a significant shift in women's fashion, represented by the flapper, a symbol of new, liberated women. Short bobbed hair, loose-fitting dresses, and the cloche hat all challenged the long-held ideas of feminine modesty. This new style allowed women to move more freely and was seen as a symbol of rebellion against the traditional, restrained gender roles that had been imposed on them. The dresses were about knee length, which was very promiscuous for the 1920s. Flappers tended to reject societal expectations of them as women. They were embracing their freedom and pushing the boundaries set in place for women. They made their makeup bold and their hair about chin length to defy gender norms of the time. Flappers did not adhere to traditional societal constraints and instead pushed boundaries. They often participated in unladylike conduct, such as going to social events without male chaperones, drinking and smoking publicly, and were even more open about their sexual endeavors. Flappers set the perfect fashion standard for young women. The government introduced Rosie the Riveter into their propaganda, and she became a symbol to women in the workforce during the war. She was first created by J. Howard Miller in 1942 and was titled, "We Can Do It," to persuade women to join the workforce. She wore a denim-colored top and red bandana. Her sleeves are rolled up with her arms to show women they can do it. Rosie showed women how to roll up their sleeves and join the workforce. Rosie the Riveter represented the millions of women who entered the workforce in industrial and manufacturing jobs traditionally held by men. The image of Rosie has come to symbolize female empowerment, strength, and independence, as well as the changing roles of women's society during World War II. Coco Chanel revolutionized women's fashion in the early 20th century by popularizing more sexist styles, such as tailored suits, shorter skirts that rejected the hyper-feminine corseted look of the previous era. Her innovative designs and bold visions changed not only the way women dressed, but also how they felt about fashion and their roles in society. One of the key aspects of her lasting impact on the fashion world is the little black dress, or the LBD, which she introduced in 1926. Prior to Chanel's design, black was considered a color of mourning and was rarely worn as a fashionable choice for day-to-day attire. Chanel's LBD was simple, elegant, and versatile, making it appropriate for a variety of occasions. This garment became a symbol of understated chic and still a staple in women's wardrobes today. The LBD embodies Chanel's philosophy of timeless, minimalist beauty. Chanel played a key role in the abandonment of corsets, which had long defined women's fashion, particularly in the 19th century. She championed the idea of comfort over construction, allowing women to move more freely and naturally in their clothing. She replaced rigid, structured garments with looser, more fluid styles, making it acceptable for women to wear clothing that didn't require painful shaping and restriction. This was a crucial step in the development of modern-day, everyday fashion. The First Lady, Jacqueline Kennedy, was idolized by women for her style during JFK's campaign and short presidency. The First Lady of the United States, her distinctive style not only made her a fashion icon, but also had a profound influence on women's fashion in the early 1960s and beyond. She embodied grace, sophistication, and innovation, setting trends that were mimicked by women across the globe. Jackie Kennedy's style was characterized by elegance, simplicity, and timelessness. She became known for a refined yet youthful look that was polished but not overly formal, embodying a mix of American and European influences. The Jackie look became synonymous with chic, modern femininity, and was admired for its clean lines, understated glamour, and poise. Transitioning from the 80s, fashion quickly moved towards more muted and casual clothing. As Kate Moss's career took off, her personal style evolved. Kate Moss started many trends during her career, from her grunge-inspired ensembles in the 90s to her more glamorous red carpet looks in the 2000s. Moss's fashion choices have always been closely watched and emulated by fans and designers alike. Some of the trends Kate Moss started are still seen in current dress. Kate Moss was one of the very few women who dressed in an unconventional way because she herself was very unconventional. Kate Moss is one of the most influential and iconic figures in the fashion industry, known for her chameleon-like adaptability, unique aesthetic, and groundbreaking influence on modeling and fashion trends. Moss's rise to fame in the early 1990s marked a dramatic shift in the modeling industry, and her impact has been felt across various sectors, including runway shows, editorial work, and high fashion campaigns, and even pop culture. The early 90s, the fashion world was dominated by supermodels like Cindy Crawford and Naomi Campbell, both of whom embodied a fuller and curvier and more traditionally glamorous look. Kate Moss, in contrast, was small, slim, and elusive, with delicate features and a waif-like physique that diverged sharply from the more voluptuous supermodels. Her slender frame and slightly disheveled, almost unkempt look challenged traditional standards of beauty in the fashion world, which at the time favored taller, fuller figured women. Fashion has been proven to be a useful tool of expression, and fashion's trends tend to shift with what is going on in the world. The evolution of women's fashion throughout history is a rich narrative that reflects broad social, cultural, economic, and political changes. From the rigid, elaborate styles of ancient civilizations to the free-flowing, individualistic expression of the modern era, women's fashion has always been intertwined with the roles and expectations placed upon women in different times and places. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Did you, I'm sorry if you said something about this and I missed it, but did you discover anything in your research about the relationship between ancient civilizations that you just mentioned and the evolution of uncomfortable shoes?
I did not look into that. No, I focused more so on like 1920s and then a little like during World War and after World War II, and then modern.
It was a great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah.
What was your favorite time period for fashion?
I think the 70s or 80s because I liked how colorful the clothes were, and I think that it was just very unique and very different from now because now it's very like muted, and I feel like a lot of darker colors. Yeah.
How did you see fashion trends be changed or co-opted differently based off of race or ethnicity in America?
I mean, a lot of just like fashion trends were more so on like what was going on. So like I focused on World War II, so a lot of that was just because of like lack of materials, and then stuff was getting more so pushed on women because that was their only option. And I did focus mostly on women, but I do know that a lot when women tended to dress differently or wasn't the style norm during these times, they were looked down upon.
In your conclusion, you mentioned how fashion represented the role of women and how it changes. And I just kind of want your opinion on, like, currently seeing how you dress up and then how your fellow women teachers dress. What kind of role do you think you were kind of portraying by what you were?
That's a really good question. And I think
It's okay if you don't have it, so it's very low.
no, I think that the way that women dress today, and it's obviously very different, it's less restricting, and I think that it has made like the fashion world a safer place, especially I feel like depending on what you're wearing, you're not necessarily looked down upon, like women for wearing pants, like that's not looked down upon anymore. So I think that seeing like teachers and everybody, I think obviously we have different dress codes, but I do think that
Okay, we're going to get started with our second presentation.
Hi, I'm Maya Zessiger, and today I will be talking about the death penalty and its historical ties to lynching. But before I get into it, I do want to give a trigger warning that a lot of the images that I will be presenting has graphic material. I also would like to clarify some of the language I will be using. For example, lynching. Lynching is an extrajudicial form of execution led by mobs, used to scare or punish historically black people without a formal trial. It is used for its use as a weapon. It's known for its use as a weapon of racial targeting and oppression throughout U.S. history. The death penalty is death as a punishment given by a court of law for very serious crimes, and under that is capital punishment, which is technically the actual execution of that punishment. However, for this presentation, I will be using those two terms interchangeably. My research topic's essential question is, how is capital punishment in the United States a continuity of lynching through its perpetuation of racial hierarchy and black oppression? So in other words, I wanted to prove how lynching paved the way for capital punishment and how that has affected modern racism in the criminal justice system, focusing in on the death penalty. So I was initially drawn to this topic through rising social movements and debates regarding the morality of the death penalty. With more and more people questioning and criticizing the criminal justice system's role as an institution of systemic racism, I became interested in learning about how historical systems of racism, like lynching and slavery, have shaped modern forms of black oppression. And drawing your attention to the slides, we can see two anti-death penalty protests, both taking place in Washington, D.C., except they occur 80 years apart, highlighting how exceptionally significant and polarized this debate remains. I would like to give some very brief background information that contextualizes lynching. The Reconstruction Amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, declared the abolition of slavery, established citizenship for black people and their equal protection, and black suffrage, respectively. Shortly after the Reconstruction Amendments, where black people experienced a rise of increasing civil rights, came the rise of institutions protecting white supremacy. Lynching rates in the United States increased during the period between Reconstruction and World War II, where over 4,400 black people were executed. Lynching was especially prominent in southern states following the fall of the Confederacy. The South's fear of possible revolts among black people and increasing civil rights spurred the rise of lynchings and widespread racism, which is highlighted in this statistic. Although black people accounted for approximately 10% of the national population and approximately 38% of the South, 73% of all lynching victims were black, and over 95% of those were tortured and killed in the former enslaved states. Now, I understand this is a lot of information at once. However, this clearly shows the disproportionate representation of black people who were lynched relative to their white counterparts. Black people were 10% of the American population, but 73% of all lynching victims. So to summarize, lynchings were racially targeted executions that instilled fear to protect racial hierarchy after the rise of black civil rights. And lynchings weren't just a means to seek vengeance and punish those whom the mobs considered guilty. They were social gatherings and celebrations of white supremacy, which is the reason why they eventually coined the term lynching picnics. Lynchings often involved the assembly of a mob, followed by brutal violence like body mutilation and being burned alive. They were typically public spectacles attended by the white community in celebration of white supremacy. facilitating laughter, food, and chants of racial slurs from an enthusiastic crowd. Photos of lynchings were often sold as souvenir postcards like the images on the screen right now, and the crowd collected tokens from executions, which would typically be body parts of these victims. Despite lynching's facade as this safeguard to protect greater social harmony from Black people, in reality it was a means to foster a collective white supremacy movement undermining Black civil rights. They used fear to maintain a social hierarchy or a racial hierarchy that had been years in the making following slavery and earlier history. The racist origins of lynching were then translated into courtrooms and juries throughout the country through capital punishment. For example, jury bleaching is a significant issue of bias and prejudice, where the person on trial is typically the only person of color in the courtroom, and the jurors deciding the fate are people who don't look like them. Prosecutors and judges actively dismiss Black people from juries, unfairly claiming that they are unfit to serve. A famous example of a biased jury was in the murder case of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Black teenage boy whom 2 white men murdered, and this is their jury, a room of white men. So you can guess they were both ruled innocent, despite later admitting to the crime. However, if we use this jury to decide a case of a Black man who was accused of killing a white woman, for example, we would expect to see a very different ruling because jury bleaching controls the racial narrative by using prejudice and racial profiling. It has grave repercussions that ultimately control whose life is worth keeping. The social history of Black inferiority went hand in hand with taking away a human life and stripping people of their right to live. There is an extremely disproportionate representation of Black people on death row. African Americans make up 41% of people on death row and 34% of those executed. However, only 13% of the population is Black. Connecting this back to lynching's impact on the modern death penalty, like lynching, the death penalty enacts violent punishment and retribution that targets Black people and foster Black oppression and racism. With proponents of the death penalty, a popular argument in defense of it is that these criminals deserve punishment for their crimes they've committed. Simply put, it is an eye for an eye. If the government does not do its duty to protect social order, there will be violent outbreaks of crime and chaos. So there must be systems in place to instill terror to deter criminals from committing these crimes. And that should sound familiar, since that is precisely what the lynching mobs believed when they took the executions into their own hands. Recently, at 6:24 p.m. on November 1st, 2024, which was 14 days ago, Richard Moore was pronounced dead. As the only Black person in the courtroom in South Carolina, Moore did not have any Black jurors deciding his case, despite the 20% Black residential population in Spartanburg County where the decision was ruled. Transitioning into the modern day, the death penalty demonstrates the racial biases that permeate American society. Lynching facilitated the rise of capital punishment as a new glorified form of racist execution in order to uphold America's global reputation of liberty and equality in a socially progressing time. Through its prejudicial and racist foundation, the death penalty emerges as a contemporary form of Black oppression. So, in conclusion, capital punishment exhibits the unforgettable impact of lynching and racial terrors on Americans today, continuing to strip humans of their right to live.
I'm thinking about how you brought up the lynching picnics and how that was a very much public spectacle where people came to enjoy themselves.
Yeah.
And I was wondering your opinion about how that has changed with current day executions being closed off and being in a room where a group of people don't know who's like, I don't want to use this phrase, but like flipping the switch or something of that kind of sort.
That's a good question. I think, as we're progressing in society, executions is becoming less and less, or I guess more, I don't want to say frowned upon, but, and by not publicizing that, it, I guess, makes it seem not as severe and brutal and immoral. Yeah, sorry, that was
No, that was a good answer.
Why has execution become more frowned upon? Like, what has caused? Because like I know that very few, still a lot of states do have the death penalty, but not all of them. So where has that cultural shift come from?
I guess it does have a lot to do, especially, for example, especially after World War II and the Vietnam War, there was a dramatic decrease in the use of the death penalty. And I guess we can attribute that to how much bloodshed there was and how, people didn't want to see more violence and death. And I guess nowadays there's also more movement and a bigger movement, collective movement to abolish the death penalty and more data and evidence to support this racial discrimination.
So do you see the death penalty becoming obsolete within the next 10 years?
I mean, well, not the president, our president we just elected, if you saw the slides, he was a public defender of the death penalty and wanted to put ads in the New York Times to support the death penalty to execute the Central Park 5. So as of now, in looking at the near future, I do not see it becoming obsolete. Yes, Mr.
I have a comment and a question. And the first comment is thank you, because I think when we study the past, we sometimes struggle to make the link to how the past influences our everyday and what those everyday manifestations look like when it comes to racism and its impact on modern society. So I really appreciated the connection that you made to this past practice and how it influences practices that we see happening every day in our prison industrial complex. And I guess my question for you is, what do you think, as we all leave here today, as we grapple with this, what is that one takeaway that you're if you remember nothing else about this presentation, what do you want us to know, understand, think, do, consider?
That's a good question. I guess the takeaway I would want to give is that everything currently is very deeply rooted in history, and history really affects what happens in the present. People a lot of the time say history repeats itself, and I guess just understanding that there's a deeper significance to problems in the world.
Thank you.
being here. My name is Max Elkin, and my topic today is the disenfranchisement of African Americans and the impact that that has had on American democracy. Now, to start off, my interest in this topic comes from a variety of different places. For one thing, I'm mixed race, so this is a part of my history and of my family's history. For another, I wanted to do my topic on American democracy kind of as a whole, but it was far too broad, so I had to narrow it down. And finally, my mother is an African American history professor, so this has always been, like one of the kind of topics that has been present in my life. Now, my essential questions are, what methods have been used throughout the United States history and in the present day to disenfranchise African Americans, and how has the continuous disenfranchisement of African Americans impacted the U.S.'s democracy? Now, I know these are fairly broad-ranging questions, so I've split up my research in this presentation into 4 eras. So, for a timeline, I have the pre-Civil War era, which encompasses foundational documents such as the Constitution and the methods used before the Civil War, the Reconstruction era and the progress that was made, as well as the legislative setbacks to enfranchising African Americans, the Civil Rights Movement era in the mid-20th century and the practices new and old to perpetuate disenfranchisement, and then moving ahead into the present day and the more subtle ways in which African Americans are still disenfranchised. Now, to start off, some historical context, I think it's important to define democracy, which literally means rule by the people, comes from ancient Greece. And America has always fashioned itself as a democracy with core values of liberty and individual rights. However, not everyone has always had equal rights, and there have always been systematic measures in place to maintain that status quo. So, pre-Civil War, African Americans were enslaved. That was the main means of disenfranchisement. The Founding Fathers knew this was inconsistent with the idea of America, and it was not properly addressed in foundational documents such as the Constitution, which does not even contain the word slavery. It has very few provisions regarding the issue, one of those being the 3/5 Compromise, which states that for all intents and purposes, African Americans are to be considered 3/5 of a person rather than a whole person. And things like the 1857 Supreme Court ruling in the case of Dred Scott v. Sanford, which decided that African Americans were not and could not be citizens, furthered the issues which culminated in the Civil War. Now, right after the Civil War, in the Reconstruction era, there was some progress made towards enfranchising African Americans, namely the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, granted citizenship to African Americans, and gave them the right to vote respectively. However, there were major legislative setbacks, such as the Black Codes, which were sets of laws adopted in southern states between 1865 and 1866, which included things like vagrancy laws, which stated that if African Americans did not have a permanent residence or occupation, they were considered vagrants and could be arrested, fined, and forced to do harsh labor if unable to pay the fines. These laws were designed to perpetuate slavery and to maintain a cheap source of labor in the South. There were also things like the Grandfather Clause, which prevented African Americans from voting and persisted well into the 20th century despite being ruled unconstitutional in 1915. Moving into the 20th century, disenfranchisement and unequal treatment of African Americans was very much still an issue. What led to the Civil Rights Movement. Things like the Grandfather Clause were still around, and literacy tests were also used to prevent African Americans from voting. Now, to focus on literacy tests just for a second, they were very unfair. The questions were designed to be rigged and almost impossible to answer. One Louisiana test, for example, that I found, had 30 questions to be answered in 10 minutes. They didn't make a lot of sense. And the clerks administering the tests had full discretion to score them however they pleased, so they got to decide what was right and wrong. And one mistake could mean that an applicant failed, whether it be an incorrect answer or a simple spelling or punctuation mistake. Here is an example of a test question from that Louisiana test. It may at first seem straightforward. You would think you'd write what's in the triangle on the line. However, if a clerk wanted an applicant to fail, they could simply say that the correct answer was to write the word down on the line as the first part of the question says. This is obviously very unfair and was a very common practice used to disenfranchise African Americans. I think it's also important to address the racial violence that civil rights movement activists faced. On the right is the Birmingham Fire Department turning their hoses on demonstrators in 1963, and on the left is a 17-year-old demonstrator in Birmingham being attacked by police dogs. Now these are two of countless other examples from this time, including the bombing of the 16th Street Church in Birmingham in 1963, and the Mississippi Freedom Summer tragedy of 1964, which saw civil rights workers attempting to help African Americans register to vote and to raise awareness about disenfranchisement, lynched by members of the Ku Klux Klan. Jumping ahead to the present day, African Americans still face disenfranchisement in more subtle ways, like felon disenfranchisement, voter ID laws, and gerrymandering. So in 2013, the Supreme Court decided in the case of Shelby County v. Holder that it was no longer fair to hold states with histories of racial discrimination to different standards when it came to voting laws. This case effectively undid Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which stated that states with histories of racial discrimination had to get federal approval in order to change voting laws. Now, with this ruling, states like Texas, Mississippi, and Georgia were able to enact voter ID laws and any other voting laws that they wanted, with Texas doing it almost immediately after the ruling came out. Now, the effect that voter ID laws specifically have on the disenfranchisement of African Americans is that African Americans, 25% of African Americans do not have acceptable forms of photo ID per the League of Women Voters. Now, felon disenfranchisement, which is the stripping of the right to vote of convicted felons after they complete their sentences, is also something that is used. You can see that primarily southern states, the red ones, are the ones that outright deny the right to vote after felons complete their prison sentence, parole, and probation. This is very much a political tool. It is no secret that African Americans are incarcerated at a higher rate than others in this country, and it is also a trend that they do not tend to vote Republican. In an article in The Conversation written by local historian Austin Serrett, he quotes Alabama Republican Party Chair Marty Connors as saying, "We're opposed to restoring voting rights because felons don't tend to vote Republican." So in short, it is very much a political issue, and felon disenfranchisement is a part of African American disenfranchisement. Racially gerrymandered districts. So this is a map of Alabama's congressional districts that was drawn up in 2021. And I want you to pay attention to the 7th congressional district over there on the left. It is 56.2% African Americans versus the 1st and 2nd and 3rd congressional districts, which are all in the low 60% range white, respectively. This is to say that African Americans are packed into the 7th district, which means they are placed in there at a higher rate than is necessary to reduce their political power in other surrounding districts and prevent them from electing representatives favorable to their needs. Now, gerrymandering is illegal, however, it is still used. Like I said, this is from 2021. This was actually, Alabama was ordered to change these districts in 2023. I'm not sure if they have. So, in conclusion, there have always been methods to disenfranchise African Americans throughout the United States' history, from slavery to the grandfather clause to voter ID laws in the modern day. There have always been things to undermine their political power, and the effect that this has had on the United States' democracy is obviously a very negative one, as their political power has been reduced, they have been denied equal access to their constitutional rights, and it has, like I said, had a very negative impact on the U.S.'s democracy, undermining its core values and the very values of democracy itself. Any questions? Zora?
What is one thing that you personally took away from researching your project?
Just that this issue is still very prevalent in the modern day. I knew it sort of was from learning about it in books like Just Mercy, and also things that we covered in AP Gov last year. And so my main takeaway was just that, like, wow, this is still such an issue in so many places across the country.
Did you see any disenfranchisement when it came to where voting booths are set up and stuff with mail-in ballots? Because I know that, for example, indigenous people who aren't black, but the vote, like where the voting booths are often far away from the reservations, and they don't have proper transportation. Is that also common in Black communities?
I don't have any specific statistics about that, but I do know that unequal access to actual locations is an issue that African Americans face. I believe I was reading in an ACLU article that in, I think the 2018 midterm, the lines at polling places for African Americans were hours long when there really should not have been. So location is definitely, like location and access to actual polling stations is definitely an issue and always has been. Ms. Chambers.
This was great, thank you. And just a really succinct, I think, timeline of disenfranchisement and again, how it shows up in everyday now. My question to you was, because you kind of started this presentation talking about democracy. And so as you think about, as you're grappling with your findings and what you've written about, how does that align or not align with your definition or as you come to understand democracy as you're writing this paper?
Well, like I said, democracy literally means rule by the people, and the fact that a large group of people in this country have, been denied access to the political process and still are, like that, it's very inconsistent with my definition of democracy and I think the textbook definition of democracy. So that's sort of what stuck out to me throughout this whole thing. Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, I'm wondering if, I guess two kind of questions, like has the research made you think about or shifted your position about federal power versus state power because of the way the state power kind of manifests itself here? And also like, does it move you in terms of like, two questions again, but like, not being allowed to vote until you're 18, like, is that seen like it's, is that a right time? It's kind of related in terms of
Yeah.
the vote.
In terms of the federal and state dynamic, it sort of just made me think that maybe this should be more of a federal issue. Like with the Shelby County v. Holder ruling, I think that, I don't necessarily agree with that ruling. I think that the Voting Rights Act should be completely protected. And I think that states obviously should have some say in how their elections are run, but I think that it needs to be federally protected in order to avoid things like gerrymandered districts and unfair ID laws and unequal access. And in terms of voting age, that's a much more complicated question, I think, a much more complicated issue. I think that there definitely needs to be a set age. I don't think that like a 5-year-old should be able to vote. I think you need to be able to form your own opinions and understandings of our system and of the issues on the table in elections. So I think that 18 is a good age for that. I think it's certainly better than what it used to be at 21.
Do you know how is gerrymandering, how is the illegality of it enforced, and how is it not enforced?
I think in terms of enforcement, I think it's like the districts are reviewed by courts. So like the Alabama ones that I pointed out, the Supreme Court as well as an Alabama District Court reviewed those in 2023 and determined them to be unconstitutional. In terms of like states getting around that, I'm not exactly certain how they get around that. Clearly they do, since that was a very recent example, but I'm not really sure how they exactly get around that.
One more question, sorry. Just thinking about where poll taxes kind of came in with your research and what your, just like your general thoughts about that in terms of this historical timeline.
Yeah, I didn't focus too much on the poll tax, I will say that. Although I will say it's definitely not fair to force people to pay to vote. Everyone should be able to have equal access to the right to vote. It's a democratic principle, it's in our foundational documents, it's part of the core values of this country, so I think that it's definitely something that, while it did exist, it should never again. Lines 15. So I could read it easily if I needed to. Look, this is 12. Like, that's a way smaller.
Good. Hi everyone, thank you for being here today. My name is Williston, and my scholar's presentation is called Privacy in Peril: The History of U.S. Government Surveillance and Its Challenge to Civil Liberties. And Mr. Doubleday mentioned to me this is kind of ironic because I know we're being filmed right now, so please don't arrest me. So some essential questions I plan to answer with this presentation are: first, is the government surveillance of U.S. citizens' data unconstitutional according to the Fourth Amendment? And secondly, is some level of surveillance necessary to protect national security? So here I have the Fourth Amendment, for those of you who are unfamiliar. This was a major part of the Bill of Rights, and it states, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects shall, against unreasonable searches and seizures, shall not be violated." So essentially, this is the right to privacy that is granted in the Constitution. So here are some possible threats to threats of government surveillance that some people cite who are against it. First, the infringement on Americans' Fourth Amendment rights, racial, religious, and cultural discrimination that can come along with it, and it can also lead to potential abuses of power by people in government. And here are some possible benefits of surveillance. First, it could help maintain safety in public areas. It could also improve crime investigation, and it could also assist in counterterrorism efforts. And this has been kind of a major benefit that people have cited in support of surveillance. So here I have a timeline of the history of surveillance throughout American history. So surveillance has played some sort of role basically since our founding in 1776. We really saw surveillance start to be a major part of our history during the Civil War, during which the Union government would use certain surveillance tactics of photography and hot air balloons to surveil Confederate soldiers and to see what they were up to. It wasn't really until the late 1800s that this became a major threat. During sort of the information revolution, we saw the rise of telegraphs and wiretapping, and this is when surveillance really became a technique both used by the government and private citizens to spy on others. So I kind of split the history of surveillance into four major stages. First, I'm going to be talking about early wiretapping in the 1900s. Then I'll be talking about the creation of the National Security Agency, the Civil Rights Movement, and how surveillance played a role in that. And finally, surveillance in the post-9/11 era that we're in right now. So like I said, the first stage of surveillance I'll be talking about is early wiretapping. So I'm going to be talking about a case called Olmstead versus the United States, which took place in 1928. And this was a very landmark, very important case in the history of surveillance. It was sort of the first time that we became aware of surveillance that was going on by the federal government. So essentially what happened in this case, like I said, it was in 1928. There was a man named Roy Olmstead who was a former police lieutenant, and this was during the Prohibition era when the sale of alcohol was deeply prohibited. So what happened in this case was there were federal agents who suspected that Olmstead was operating an illegal liquor business. So to gain evidence in this case, they wiretapped his phones leading up to his office and his residence, and based on communications and data they received from his phone calls, they were able to conclude that he had been selling alcohol and that this was an arrestable offense. So this was the first major case of surveillance being used by federal agents. So the person who wrote the majority opinion in this Supreme Court case, when it did reach the Supreme Court, was William Howard Taft, who was also U.S. President. And essentially in this case, he claimed, quote, "The insertions were made without trespass upon any property of the defendants." So his claim was that because the agents did not physically trespass on his property to wiretap and listen to his conversations, this was not a constitutional violation. So the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in the agents' favor. They believed this was not a constitutional violation, and federal agents were allowed to do this to gain evidence in a case. And on the other side, we had Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who wrote the dissenting opinion in this case. And he said in his opinion, quote, "The founders had conferred against the government the right to be let alone, the most comprehensive of rights, and the right most favored by civilized men. So he believed strongly that this was a constitutional violation, that in no way could federal agents view or spy on private communications, whether it was phone or mail or anything else, and still do it constitutionally. So this was a very passionate rebuke of the idea of the government surveilling its citizens, and this was kind of the first case in which someone said, this is not right, this is not constitutional. And in his case, he was also quoted saying, "The greatest dangers to liberty lurk in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning but without understanding." So he believed that one of the threats of government surveillance is its misuse and abuse by people who desire power and basically control over other people's information. So the second phase of national security and surveillance is the National Security Act, which was passed in 1947. So this was a piece of legislation that was passed in response to World War II, when Harry Truman, who signed the bill, realized we needed more surveillance techniques to deal with foreign threats and foreign adversaries. So this led to a major restructuring of national defense in this country, and it also led to the creation of the NSA, the National Security Agency, which is now probably the largest and most well-funded surveillance agency we have. So the third phase is surveillance during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. So at this period, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI in 1967 quietly unleashed, quote, a covert surveillance targeting subversive, what he called subversive, civil rights groups and Black Party movements, including the Black Panther Party, Martin Luther King, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, and many others. So while they claimed that they were operating this campaign to prevent terrorism, what they called terrorism during the civil rights movement, it was essentially a way to suppress any sort of political tactics that they did not agree with. So while we know that this civil rights movement was very successful in promoting rights for Black Americans, a lot of these attempts were thwarted by the surveillance of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI at this point. And they would often read phone communications and mail by MLK and others, and they really tried to suppress their actions through the surveillance. So the next stage in surveillance in American history is after 9/11. So 9/11 ushered in very important changes in the way our country operated. One of these was airport security. We became a country that prioritized security a lot more. And soon after 9/11, because we realized we needed more surveillance to deal with this, at least the Bush administration believed so, we passed the Patriot Act in 2001. And essentially this allowed the government to surveil a lot of online activity, and it was a major pivotal moment in surveillance because it allowed the government to view cell phone records, email data, and also it forced some tech companies like Google to disclose information they thought could pose a threat to national security. So in 2013, something very important in surveillance happened. There was a man named Edward Snowden who was an insider at the NSA, and in 2013 he basically leaked a huge number of documents that exposed surveillance activities in the NSA that had previously been unknown. So what he leaked was highly classified information from the National Security Agency that disclosed numerous global surveillance programs, many run by the NSA and the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which was also part of national security. And he revealed that the NSA had been relying on telecommunications data from the European Union and from the US that was obtained from major tech companies. And he was actually indicted on espionage charges for these leaks, and he is now seeking refuge in Russia. And he would probably be arrested and seek further retribution if he came back into the US. So since the Snowden leaks, there have been some major changes to the NSA and the way surveillance operates in this country. So in 2015, Congress passed the United States Freedom Act to reform Section 215 of the Patriot Act and to prohibit nationwide bulk collection of telephone metadata. So bulk collection was basically a strategy they would use to force big tech companies to reveal their data. And the NSA's programs were faced with a more narrow call detail records program to ensure that surveillance was targeted rather than having this bulk collection of data. So the Snowden leaks did support sort of a referendum on surveillance, but we still see a lot of surveillance techniques, and really not much has changed since then. So like I said, the NSA, since its creation, has depended on data obtained from large private corporations, and this relationship has become a lot closer in the years since 9/11. So since the rise of the internet and large technology companies like Amazon Web Services, Google, Facebook, and Yahoo, the NSA has come to rely on partnerships with private companies to collect data. And today the NSA depends on Amazon Web Services to receive billions of data points on American citizens, and even despite what we know about the NSA, this sort of surveillance and this relationship with private companies continues today. So here are some closing thoughts based on the research I've done on this topic. So first, in response to my essential question, I believe surveillance conducted by the NSA and FBI does pose a threat to Americans' Fourth Amendment rights, and I believe that it's very difficult for Fourth Amendment rights to be upheld when so much surveillance is going on. And secondly, while some surveillance of foreign organizations may be necessary to maintain national security, the government should not be collecting data on everyday American citizens. So I understand, especially in a very globalized world, sometimes there are threats that have to be detected from foreign terrorist organizations, and sometimes threats within the U.S., but I don't think that justifies surveilling everyday American citizens when very few people pose an actual threat to our national security. And finally, I'll leave you with this. If history has taught us that information is power, who do we want to wield it? And I would suggest that people in the government, this bureaucracy, is not who we want wielding our power. Thank you. Any questions? Jason?
If you're against the government looking at your data, how do you feel about Williston being able to see everything you have on your computer?
I don't support it. I mean, I'm not sure we can do anything about that, but yeah, I wouldn't say I'm a fan. Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, can you go back to the previous slide? You were saying that you think they should not be collecting data on everyday American citizens, but that it's okay for non-American citizens?
Yeah, I believe sometimes foreign evidence can be collected. I'm not saying it's amazing, but I think the fact that Americans have Fourth Amendment rights means we definitely shouldn't be surveilling American citizens. I think foreign citizens is sort of a different issue.
Right, so legally I get that, but I wonder if you think there's really a moral difference, like in the sense of I understand legally American citizens are protected, but why morally should non-U.S. citizens be able to be surveyed? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say morally, personally, I don't think anyone should be surveilled. I would just kind of approaching it from the legal stance, which is there's definitely reason to not surveil American citizens. But I agree with you. I think morally we should have as little surveillance as possible. My mom, by the way.
Thanks, Olin. Yeah, I guess we'll have to close our blinds and our doors now. This is actually related to this question. So what about in families where there may be an undocumented citizen and a citizen? So I guess morally, but also according to the Fourth Amendment, one household. What are your thoughts, or what have you discovered about how that would work if you have a family where some of the family would have Fourth Amendment rights and some would not?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think it goes back to what Mr. Johnson was saying, that in an ideal world we would have no surveillance, but I think legally speaking, probably someone who's undocumented might be subjected to more surveillance. But yeah, it's unfortunate. So I think try to roll back just all surveillance of undocumented immigrants, whether just legal immigrants or undocumented. I think either way we should try to limit surveillance. But it's definitely a difficult question because legally you might be able to surveil or spy on someone who's not here legally over someone who is. So yeah, it's difficult. Ms. Poland?
Did your research extend to the data that private companies are collecting on U.S. citizens and whether that squares with these laws?
Yeah, a little bit. I looked more on government data, but I think there's just sort of this collusion, like I mentioned, between private companies and the government. And I think right now there is an effort to try to limit what the private companies can collect. Like there's the, I think it's called the Information Privacy Act that's going through Congress right now. So I did look at that a little bit. But I think it's so difficult because the NSA depends on data they collect from private companies, so it's sort of hard to differentiate between the two. Parker?
You're looking to not choose on me. Okay, 2 questions, if you're okay with that. The first one is, what do you think about, let's say if I, on a public forum on Reddit, as an American citizen, posted I want to shoot at my school? Can the NSA, in your idea, should they be able to look at that information and be like, oh, Parker said she's going to do this, now we're going to follow through on that and neutralize the threat?
Yeah, I think if there was like a targeted piece of information they received, obviously they should act on that, but I think a lot of the data they collect, it's not one specific threat, they take a huge bulk of data and then sift through it. But obviously if they see one threat, they should be able to respond to it. Yeah.
Second question, how do you think this will change with Roe v. Wade being overturned? Because that was a huge thing about privacy, was my right to have an abortion. And now there are national databases that are starting to be formed with women who have abortions and like, do you think that is also, like, do you think Roe v. Wade, the loss of that has worsened the issue?
I think it definitely has. Yeah, a lot of people say that Roe v. Wade, repealing it is unconstitutional because the Fourth Amendment grants the right to privacy, and some people believe abortion is part of that. So I think it could definitely add to this issue and exacerbate it. Yeah. Jack?
Do you think that it's intelligent for the United States not to collect data if other countries aren't adhering to the same sort of surveillance standards? So if they're getting information on our activity, but we're not on there within the country, is that necessarily intelligent from just a government standpoint?
Yeah, from like a strategic standpoint, I see what you're saying. I think there are definitely cases when we do have to collect data, and that's kind of why I was saying it's more understandable collecting data about foreign organizations rather than domestic ones. So I think you're right, it would put us at a disadvantage if we stopped doing that. Anything else? Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody. My students, I have your rough draft.
You got lots of questions. When you are talking about collecting American citizens versus folks that might not have U.S. citizenship, where do you think domestic terrorism fits in with that as you think about like the KKK and other